Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at how to persist our storage of the access token and the ID token and claims in the browser, so when it closes down, we still have access to all that stuff and we don't need to re-sign in. We also took a look at how to, again, add the claims to our ID token and access token. It wasn't much different. And the main finale was really learning how to refresh your access token using Axios. But again, this method applies to any HTTP client as long as you follow the steps. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at persisting the configuration. So right now, this configuration that we have here, we sort of loaded up into memory. The same thing that we're doing with our database here is we're using an in-memory database. So what we're going to do is, I'm not going to pretend like I know this off by heart. We're going to follow through on what they have in the documentation. And we're just going to basically pick stuff apart one by one, and anything that I remember that was confusing, I'm going to go over it, and I'm going to share some tips on how to basically be a bit more productive with this thing. Okay, so the main concept of this is all the configuration, we want to move it into the database, right? So the first thing that we have to get is this IdentityServer4 entity framework package. So let's go ahead, copy this name, go into the Identity Server project, right click, and manage NuGet packages. And let's browse for this package. There it is. Let's go ahead and install it. Accept. Another thing I also want to do is, before we had an in-memory store. Did we install? Yep. So here we specifically install an in-memory entity framework sort of module. So I want to copy this namespace and I want to browse for the SQL one because that's where I'm going to store it, so we can have a little bit more visual over it. So we want Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server package. Let's go ahead and install that. Okay, so now that we have these two, let's go ahead, close this, and I thought there was an error. Give me a second. Oh. Okay, it looks like it didn't install it because there was a version mismatch, but let's go ahead and sort of bring everything into the same version. Since I know it's called SQL Server, we can just rename this to SQL Server. Save that, and that should reinstall the package right here. If you get a warning, you probably renamed it, so you want to uninstall the in-memory one, or make sure that you download the version 3. So because we're now going to be using sort of Identity Server with Entity Framework, I actually want to go ahead and bring everything down to version 3 as well, just to avoid any other version errors. Okay, so after the warning sign is gone here, let's go ahead, close this, and follow through the documentation a little bit more. Alright, so we've added the package. It explains a little bit more about what they have, but it doesn't really matter at this point. We have got the SQL Server package as well, so this basically means that we're ready to connect to the database. This section pretty much just gives you a bit of explanation of what the packages contain, and then following this section basically explains how all this stuff that we currently load into memory, that has to be replaced with these two lines. And the test users, we don't really need that, so we just want to add these configuration stores. So let's go ahead, copy those parts, and we'll drop down to Identity Server. We will still use add developer sign-in credentials, and these two parts, let's go ahead comment or 3 parts rather. Let's comment them out and bring these parts in. Okay, so at this point, let's format this a bit. So we have a few errors. So migration assembly, this is pretty much where do we want to store our migrations. So one way to do this, we can go ahead, grab the assembly by going type of startup. So the startup is the class, and this class is in the assembly of Identity Server, and we can go ahead and grab the assembly from the startup, and we can just pass it here. And it is actually expecting a string, so I guess we just grab get name or something like that. Yeah. Assembly name. Nope. This is still a string. Yep. So, and we grab the name. Okay. At this point, don't need that semicolon there. And we also need a connection string, which will also need a connection string for our database here. So I think this is a good time to actually set up the database connection. So let's go into the config. Let's choose use SQL Server, and we will pass the connection string into here as well. So let's go ahead, grab the constructor here. So we will need to grab our configuration to grab the connection string from the app settings. So let's inject our I configuration, and not from AutoMapper. So let's go ahead and just call this config. Create a field. It doesn't really matter too much for its name, to be honest. What I want to do is, or I guess it actually does. Let's go ahead and call it like this. Let's go ahead and grab the connection string. So var connection string equals config get connection string, and we will call it default connection. Right, and now what I will do is I will go into the Server Explorer or not Server Explorer, sorry, SQL Server Object Explorer, and this should come with Visual Studio. You can install Microsoft SQL Server. If you don't have this bar here, you can search it up here, so you can just type in SQL and you find the SQL Server Object Explorer. Click on that, and there you go. So we want to connect to this database. And if we right click and go to properties, we can go all the way up here and grab the connection string here. So let's copy that and hopefully close this. Hopefully that has copied, otherwise I'll have to make another trip. We will need to make a section here, connection strings, because you can have multiple. That's kind of how it works with this default with this get connection string, and then we want to name it default connection. All right, so default connection. Hopefully you know how it works by now. I don't want to spend too much time explaining this stuff. All right, so here we have our connection string to the local server here. If you have another one, point your connection string to there. If you have trouble setting up connections to an SQL server, identity server is probably a topic a little bit far out of your reach. You want to get down connecting to SQL servers first, right? So here we are connected. We have a connection string, and we are passing it to here as well. Okay, nice. So a little bit about these two. They are essentially two different categories of information that is going to be stored in the database. The first category is basically the configuration that we have in this file. So our clients, our API information, and our identity resources. This is essentially the static information, the sort of configuration information, right? The configuration for the identity server configuration in that sense, right? And then for the operational stuff, if we go to the documentation, essentially it's the part where they described right here under the identity server for entity framework section. The configuration DB context is basically the configuration data, and persistent grant DB context, basically temporary operational data such as authorization codes and refresh tokens, right? So it keeps track of the authorization codes that it deals out, that is used to retrieve the access token and refresh token, and the refresh token that gets dealt out and which can then be used to retrieve access tokens and refresh tokens. And just so we're aware that these two parts essentially correlate to these two, respectively. Okay, so going further here, oh yeah, they did something similar here. Connection string, they inlined it here. Haha, noobs, we put it in the app config. Anyway, going forward, we want to add the migrations. Now, you don't want to be returning to this documentation every time you are going to be resetting you will need to rerun your migrations. So let's say before you're going to go live, you will need to rerun these on your live database. So you don't want to be popping in here And usually I have a couple of scripts that I run, and what I do is if I go to my project, I just create a new file and I call it something like dbscript.txt. I don't know how to write PowerShell scripts or nothing like that. And I like to just paste this stuff here, right? So I can just open the command line, paste this in, and it will just work, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and look in the documentation just so we don't forget anything. This line basically says install entity framework, and this basically says install another package to help you design database. I don't think we need it anymore in .NET Core 3. This might be an old part of the documentation. Okay, another thing that these commands will do right here, they set the output option, so this is where it's going to be outputted. So let's go ahead and see. Yeah, we have the data folder, so we're expecting to see some new folders here. And again, for the DB context that they have, configuration DB context, again, that relates to the configuration, and that will contain all the tables for storing configuration. And persisted grant DB context is for the operational side. Okay, so let's go ahead and run these. So I'm going to go ahead, click on Identity Server. I'm going to open my terminal, and I will just copy the first script, the first line. I'll paste it here, and I will enter it. Okay, and this error actually looks like I don't have installed entity framework. So let's go ahead and copy that command. I'm pretty sure I had it before, but let's go ahead and copy this first one to install the tools. Sorry, let's go into the command line after I learn how to copy. Okay, so it seems like there is some version mismatch here. So let's go ahead and check what version it thinks I'm using. So .NET version 3.01. Okay, if we're on version 3.0.1, maybe it's a smarter idea to bump all the versions here to 3.1. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, are there packages of that version though? Let's do it for the NuGet package manager. Right, so let's go into updates. Let's update everything to 3.0. Let me close this. And let's upgrade this. 3.2. I guess, what harm would it be? Let's upgrade them all. Let's see if we face any more issues here. Okay, let's try build this. Okay, get the console. Let's try to install the stuff again. Let's try to specify the version of 3.0. Okay. How about, can we run the command now? Okay, so I guess we still do need this package as well. So let's go ahead and get that. So yeah, let's grab this. I guess it uses it internally. I thought that was something that the functionality of the identity server needed it before. So let's browse for it. Let's grab the 3.0.1 version. The bleeding edge. Nice. Right. So we got it. Finally, let's try to run this. So it does recognize that the tools are older. Maybe I will give it one more try. Let's try to be explicit with the version we're trying to install. I guess we would have to update or something. You know what? It works. I don't mind. It didn't like installing 3.0.1. Maybe that's actually, and I did have the correct version. I don't know. Maybe something's bugged, but I have it working for now, so I don't mind it. Let's go ahead and grab the second script, paste it in here, and after I learn how to copy. Okay, so let's exit this. At this point, we pretty much have two things in our migrations for the identity server, the configuration DB and persistent grant DB, right? And these are just migrations, right? So anytime you make changes to your database models, you want to scaffold the tables, and then you want to run the updates. The way we update the database now is just how we would update it regularly, right? So we would just run .NET database update, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now we get an error that basically more than one context has been found. So we have to pretty much run .NET database update for 3 different contexts, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'd like to type these out. So .NET database update, and let's just copy the context here, copy it one more time, paste the configuration, and we can also pop one for our own very own appdb context, right? And maybe it's going to be worth pinning this here to just observe the changes that we're going to see. And let me grab the app settings and make sure that we're not going to be going into the master catalog. Let's actually name this something like authentication tutorial. So it should put us somewhere at the top. We actually have authorization tutorial. Let's call this IdentityServer4 tutorial. Okay. Right. So .NET EF database update. Let's go ahead and try to run this, specifying our appdb context. And through this, I'm expecting to see my user tables with the claims and stuff. Right, so that's done. Let's go ahead and give the databases a refresh. And here I see IdentityServer4 tutorial. Let's go ahead and take a look at the tables. And we have nothing because I haven't run migrations for it. Shame on me. So let's go ahead and actually create the migrations. Let's copy this. Let's put this down here, and I will just put them into the appdb context folder. And the context that I want to run them for is the appdb context. So there we go. Right. Bumpy ride, but this is what happens in the real world. So let's run this. Oh, why doesn't it copy? Right. Initial. Looks like there was also a name here. So let's go ahead and just remove this, or we'll do something like this, specify a name. So next time we copy this, we paste it, we know that we have to put a name there. So again, let's copy this. Let's remove this, and the name that we want to put is initial for now. Okay, nice. Let's go ahead and update the database again after our migrations have been created. Build has failed, so let's go ahead and build it. And it looks like our CS project failed. What? Everything is going wrong today. Okay, you don't name your namespace like your class. So let's go ahead and delete the migrations. Learning a lot this episode. So instead of appdb context folder, I want to set app migrations. So let's go ahead and copy this, paste this here, and let's not forget to specify the name. Okay, now, do we build? We do. Can we update the database? We can. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. Refresh. There's our all user tables. Beautiful. Let's go ahead, and these migrations, we have already run them, so we only need to update the database, right? And really, these scripts, you're going to run them once. You want to keep a hold of them in case something happens, in case you need to delete all the migrations and restart, just keep them here. And these scripts, again, just makes this a little bit easier and a little bit faster next time you're going to do it. Okay, this works as well. Let's go ahead and give this a refresh. Okay, and we have gotten 2 new tables, which is devices codes and persistent grants. Let's go ahead and set up the configuration. Okay, And that's done as well. This has way more tables, and these are primarily starting with client. So client claims, course origins. So this is just the setup. And once we have a bit more data in there, we'll take a look at it. We have also the API setup and the identity information setup, right? So again, our identity resources, API, and clients have been split into these three chunks, right? And additionally, we have this persistent and devices codes, right? So these are all the tables that Identity Server brings. Next thing in the documentation is going to be something regarding initializing database, right? And we did this like 1,000 times in all the other tutorials. So let's go ahead and copy this whole thing, not the using statement, everything inside the using. And we will take it into the program CS because we already sort of do the kind of the seeding there. I will pin down the SQL Server Object Explorer. And in here, let's say after we add the user, this is where we're going to set up the seeding for our identity server, right? So this config is what they refer to as their configuration file. So let's go ahead and replace every config with configuration. And we will replace these clients, IDs, and APIs properties with function calls. Is that what we had? Get clients, right? Get clients. Then we want get, this is going into the identity resources, so that's what we want to say, get identity resources. And then we want to say get APIs, right? So we're getting stuff from our configuration and then we're putting it into the database. So we still have this configuration here, but then once it's in the database and it's going and it's live, we can interact with it through the SQL server or go as far as building our own client to change the settings, right? Depending on how far you want to take it. Right, so next thing is this context right here. Let's go ahead and actually bring it in because right now this error might be nothing to worry about. I don't know yet, but this context is basically not resolved. It doesn't know what type it is, right? So we have this scope, and this is where we use the service provider to get the required service for our user manager. We want to do the same thing, but do it for these two DB contexts, right? So let's go ahead and service scope. Let's just replace it with scope and import the namespaces for these two DB contexts. All right, and let's do an import for this ensure migration thing. And do we need to context? Nah, that'll be good. Let's give this a bit of space. And for any, we will need to import link. Okay, and to entity still errors. I don't think we need to pass it here. Let's go ahead and try to get rid of it. And whoop, I'm back a little bit too far. So I guess we do need to entity, and we are gonna need some namespace, I guess. Yep, mapper. There we go. Okay, so here we're essentially doing the seed. Not much to it. We get the DB context from the service scope. We apply the migrations if they haven't been. So this essentially ensures that the latest versions of the tables are there. And then we have the actual seeding, right? So this is where the configuration that we have here is going to get inputted into the database. We could have our basically, oh, wrong file. The users that we create here, we can just put it in here and it would be the same thing. So we have the user, we have the stuff in the database. Once this runs, let's go ahead and look in the documentation one more time, just in case we're missing anything, right? So a bunch of namespaces that we need to do. Initialize database, that's because their example shows how to basically do it through the startup. Here we're actually just going to do it at program startup, not in the startup. Basically here they describe somewhere here. Yeah, so they basically describe you want to do this database initialization at some reasonable location, which program CS is pretty much where you want to do it. And yeah, that was the end of their setup. So let's go ahead and run this. And if I just close all this stuff and bring the server, not the server, SQL Explorer back here, and we'll just take a look at the clients and we'll view data here. I'll run the project and we're going to inspect what kind of data we get in our tables. Okay, so everything's loaded. I will keep a hold of the home page. In a minute, we're just going to observe what's happening, right? So when I first queried it, the client's table, it was empty. Here, if I refresh it, we essentially see our, if I can zoom in, no, it doesn't let me zoom in. So sorry if you can barely see, but we have the 3 clients from our clients, and really there's not much to talk about here. Other than, for example, if the access token lifetime, I can go ahead and edit it through here right now, right? So it kind of, you get all the benefits of a data, of storing it in the database and not in memory. You have direct access to the tables and it's very easy to edit it, and you can make a separate client for configuring this data, right? So you can do something like creating clients on the fly if you build a custom client around these database objects. So my SQL Object Explorer is gone. Let me bring it back up here. Okay. Yeah. So I guess before taking a look at persistent grants and device codes, we can take a look at our identity resources. And again, we can just take a look at what we have. We have our 2 scopes that are registered to use, right? So remember that this is just the configuration data, right? The stuff that you had in your configuration file, it gets mapped to here. So through the code in our program CS, where we have written it here, right? So this is what it does. It looks for if there is anything in these tables, go ahead and create these entities, right? And it will do it for each individual of these tables, for API resources, identity resources, and clients, and the rest of the information is pretty much just the properties for those. So, for example, like client redirect URIs, we will only have 2 here. One is for, or rather, it's better to look at this client ID. 2 and 3, we don't have one for the credentials flow because that doesn't really need a redirect URI, right? And again, if we look at the API resources, the same thing. It's just the configuration data in the database now. So if we close the application, we launch it again, we will be using this data. And if you would like to overwrite it, we would need to delete these records and seed them again. Right. So let's take a look at persistent grants. It will be a little bit hard to see the authorization code, but the refresh token we'll be able to see. So with the JavaScript client, we don't have an authorization code and we don't have a refresh token. So if we sign in and do our normal thing and refresh here, we won't see anything, right? However, if I go ahead and turn on the MVC client, so I'm going to go into solution properties here. I'm going to say start the MVC client. Let's apply this. Okay. And let's fire this up. Okay, so on the MVC client here, if I go to home/secret and I go to pop password and sign in. So once I'm here, let's go ahead and refresh this. Again, we're not going to see the authorization code because it went past so quickly. It's already been used up. But I guess you would actually be able to see it if essentially the authorization code gets dealt out and you're sort of holding it onto it before actually retrieving your access tokens. The record would be here. However, we do have a record for your refresh token for the subject and what client it's on. And again, this is just the key value for this token. All right, so hopefully this gives you a little bit more of what the operational data actually is, right? Remember that we don't need to store the ID token and the access token because they're meant to be these stateless ways to identify and to distribute access to your resources. And from the previous tutorial where we found out that they're validated on the fly using the signature. Okay, but this is essentially it for this episode. It was a bit of a bumpy ride, but it always is when it comes to entity framework and the database and trying to wire up these 2 things together, especially with a third-party dependency. Nevertheless, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to leave a comment if you have any questions. Also, join the Discord server. I tend to be pretty active there, and I'll see you around.